everyone, welcome back to Story of the World Chapter Highlights. I'm Sophie teacher, and today we're going to talk about chapter 22 of your Story of the World 4 books. Now the main topic for today's chapter is all about uprisings in different places, especially uprisings against the British government. Now the first part of our chapter talks about what was happening in Ireland, and the second half will talk about what was happening in India. Now with Ireland, there's lots and lots to talk about, so let's get started. So one important thing I want you to really remember is what we talked about previously with Ireland, okay? And that was the Home Rule Bill. If you remember, William Gladstone, who was the Prime Minister in England, actually had fought for this Home Rule Bill in Parliament. But Parliament had shut him down and said they didn't want it. But the Home Rule Bill would basically mean that Ireland was able to govern itself. But this was shut down, and yeah, it never happened. So by the time we get to the early 1900s, Irish people are starting to get a little tired of English rule. England had been ruling Ireland for around 700 years at this point. So they were getting tired, and they were worried they were going to start losing their Irish heritage. So this thing called the boycott happened. They said it was a boycott against kind of English culture and English rule. And lots of different groups started to pop up around Ireland that supported Irish culture and history. Things like the Gaelic League, the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Irish Land League, the Irish Republic Brotherhood, and Young Ireland. Gaelic is the original language in Ireland. People in Ireland spoke Gaelic, but after the English came to rule, everyone was forced to learn English. So people were trying to reclaim Gaelic because it was starting to die out around Ireland. Also, the famous poet from Ireland, William Yeats, he also started to write things in support of Irish independence. Now, in 1905, Sinn Féin, who is one of the government groups that was starting in Ireland, Sinn Féin decided to come together and they made a group. They said, okay, we could lead Ireland and we'd be under the British Crown, but we'd have our own parliament. Okay? Now, Catholics around Ireland were quite happy with this. They said, we like the idea of this. We could be happy with this. But the other group of Christians in Ireland, the Protestants, weren't very happy. Now, if you remember, Catholics and Protestants have fought quite a lot throughout the history we've learned, right? And the Protestants mainly lived in the north of Ireland, around 6 counties in Northern Ireland. And they called this area Ulster. Ulster, because the British and the English were Protestants, had a lot more money invested into it. There was factories and a lot more, better jobs there. But the Catholics were mainly more in the southern part of Ireland, and that was a lot of farm work with the British landlords who lived there. So people weren't too sure about this. And the Protestants ended up making the Ulster Covenant and the Ulster Volunteer Force. Now, the Ulster Covenant basically said if Ireland got the Home Rule Bill and governed itself, they would fight against it. They wouldn't be very happy about it and they would fight against it because they wanted to be Protestants and they were worried the Catholics would push them away. Now, by the time we get to April 24th, 1916, this is when this guy comes in, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was one of the Fenian leaders. He was one of the leaders in this government party. And he was fighting for home rule. He believed Ireland should have, its own government. And so him and some of his loyal followers ended up storming into post office and banks and lots of different institutions around Ireland and rebelling. And the British weren't very happy about this. This was called the Easter Uprising. It was a weekend after Easter, and the British soldiers came in and around 400 people died fighting. And then after that, 16 rebel leaders were taken by the British and they were put to death for rebelling against the British Crown. Now, 3 years later, eventually, the Irish Assembly was allowed to open, which was the Irish Parliament. And they would govern themselves no matter what the British said. That's what they said. No matter what the British said, we will do what we want. And this is when our figure Michael Collins comes in. Now, Michael Collins made this new group, a new army, called the Irish Republic Army, also known as the IRA. Now, the British were worried about this. They knew that someone with an army behind them was very, very dangerous, and they didn't like the sound of this at all. So in 1921, the Irish and the British signed a treaty, and they agreed on the Irish Free State. The Irish Free State would be under the British Crown, and Ulster, that northern part with the Protestants in, would be part of Great Britain. Also, Yeats, the poet we talked about, was invited to join the Parliament, okay? He was invited to join the Irish Parliament. Now, lots of people were mad at Michael Collins because he'd been one of the people who'd agreed to this. And they were like, but would still be under the British Crown after everything. And Michael Collins ended up getting assassinated by some of the people on his side, some of the other rebels. And then by 1923, Ireland had become self-governing, but it was split into two parts. You had this part, which was the Republic of Ireland, and the very top, which became Ulster, which would then be known as Northern Ireland, which is still currently part of the United Kingdom. Now, let's go on to our second part of the chapter today. Now, the second part of our chapter today was talking about India. Okay, now one thing I want you to remember about what we've studied about India so far is firstly, the British had put this person in charge, the Viceroy of India. The Viceroy of India was basically just someone who was there to govern over India for Queen Victoria. Okay, so it wasn't instead of, but it was for Queen Victoria. At this time, the British were calling India Raj, which was the Indian word for kingdom. And also the capital had moved from Calcutta, the original capital, to Delhi. So now it was Delhi that was the capital, okay? And this was like the expansive British India. Now the British said, okay, we really need to start doing more things in India. So what they did was they started building railroads, they built more roads for traffic to go down, and they also built telegraph lines for more ease of communication. They thought we really should start building India up more. It's one of our colonies. There are people now. But there was still a big disparity. There was a big difference still between the British and the Indians. The British and Indians lived in very separate neighborhoods, very different houses. The British were always a lot richer than the Indians were, and the Indians often worked as servants in British homes. So there was still a big gap between British people and Indian people in India. And this is where this guy comes in, which you might have already heard of this name before. So this is Gandhi. Gandhi had spent a lot of time in South Africa, okay? So Gandhi had spent a lot of time in South Africa, and he'd come back to India and he thought, I'm going to see what my country's like. And he was shocked to see how poor it was and the issues they'd had around India too. So he started the Congress Party. He said he was going to help India get its independence from the British. He traveled around India by train and he got more and more followers as he went. And millions of Indians joined with him and agreed that they also wanted independence. Now, Gandhi and a few others went to the city of Amritsar. Amritsar was a holy city in India, and it was where a lot of people that followed the Sikh religion would go to have as their holy site and pray and do what they needed to do. Now, at this site was a temple, and there was a large gathering because Gandhi had gone there. Lots of people came with him and joined together at this temple. Now, one of the rules the British had made was that nobody could gather in groups. There was no right of assembly in India at this time. So some British soldiers came by and they saw this mass collection of people protesting together, wanting Indian independence. And rather than giving them a chance to talk or a chance to flee, the British soldiers opened fire at the crowd of people. Now, this caused the death of somewhere, they think, between 300 up to 1,000 people. The people were unarmed and the British soldiers shot at them. Now, Gandhi said, we need to fight against this, but we need to fight against this with a non-violent approach. He said if you used violence, it wouldn't work very well for you at the end. Okay, so you had to use non-violent methods. So he instructed his followers and the people of India to boycott the British. He said, don't pay their taxes. If they ask you for taxes, don't pay for them. Don't use British goods. Boycott British goods. Take your children out of British schools as well. Even it got to a point that the British put a tax on salt. So Gandhi walked 240 miles to the sea and helped other Indian people collect salt from the sea so they didn't have to use the taxed British salt. Now, the British put Gandhi in jail again and again and again over the years, but it didn't work. And from this point onwards, India would move towards independence. Well done, everyone. Bye.